Welcome to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, mysterious voice, and welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I have found in my travels. Today I want to talk about a short story from Norway. That's the weird connection because, I'm not actually sure that Norway exists. It could be a running gag on the part of the United Kingdom and other European nations to convince us of a fictional country. But I don't think Norway actually exists. And so this specific short story focuses on fatherhood, of all things. I am referring to The Father by Bjørnson, published in 1860. For those that don't know, and that would include me, Bjørnson, and I really hope I'm pronouncing that name correctly, was a Norwegian writer in the 1800s. He won a Nobel Prize in his time, although he was part of the committee too, so, giving yourself an award doesn't really feel all that special, at least in my opinion. But he's considered one of the big four Norwegian writers out there, along with Henry Ibsen, which is a name I've heard. The other two, who I'll put somewhere around here, I haven't heard of, and I've immediately forgotten. So there's that. He wrote books and plays, although he felt he was excluded from the community at the times, and didn't write so much because of his leftist views, I think, which got put him by the wayside at times. But he believed there was a need for a national language, as well as national identity for Norway. And he was also accused of treason at the time for his views. Whether or not he actually committed any treason remains to be seen. He had to go in exile for some time too. Another interesting thing is during the Dreyfus affair that lasted in the late 1800s, early 1900s. He was on the side of Dreyfus, so that's always a quality thing to learn about a person, that they weren't some sort of scapegoating anti-Semite that would make his reading hard to enjoy. So that's Bjørnson, pretty interesting character. Don't know too much about his writing. This is my first encounter of it. So without further ado, let's talk about The Father. I'll do a summary and analysis, and we will move on from there. So The Father focuses on the character of Thord Overas over the course of 25 years of his son's life. One day he visits the local church and talks to the priest about getting his son baptized. His son's name is Fenn, recently born, and he wants to get him baptized. But more so than that, he wants to baptize the child himself. I think, which is different than how it's usually done. I'm not a religious man myself. And the priest agrees to that, and also notes that he hopes that Fenn will be a blessing upon Thord in the coming years. 16 years later, he once again visits the church for his son's confirmation, another rite in that religion. He inquires about his son's position during this confirmation thing, and he's told that it's number one. So he pays for these things to happen, and then he goes on his day. He visits the church again 8 years later, and he tells the priest that his son is going to get married to a certain woman from the village. And the priest notes that woman is fairly wealthy, so that's good for his son. And Thord wants the church to recognize the marriage so that it's officially official in the eyes of God, or something like that. So then the father departs again. About 2 weeks later, Fenn and Thord are on a boat when Fenn falls overboard and ends up drowning in the water. Thord drags the lake over the course of about 3 days and finally finds his son's body so that he can give him a proper burial. A year later, he shows up, still kind of grief-stricken and affected by this loss that he just felt. his hair is a bit grayer, as the priest notes. And then he tells the priest that he sold his guard, which I believe is his estate, and he's giving the money to the church, which is always nice. And he says he's going to move on to something better. The story ends with the priest noting that Finn was truly a blessing for Thord, echoing what he said at the beginning of the story, and that's where it ends there. In terms of analysis, this is a really short story, but there's still a bit to acknowledge and talk about here. One thing that I couldn't help but notice is in the locations in the place where I found the story, and when seeing people discuss it, there's a lot of mentions about how this story is about pride, and how Thord learns a lesson about being too prideful as it relates to his son. And when his son dies, he learns humility. But I think that's kind of weird and kind of overreaching, in my opinion. I feel like the story more highlights fatherhood and how a father will do anything for his son, for his children. You see that at the very beginning of the story when he shows up for his son's baptism. Not only does he want to do the baptism, but he wants to do it himself, which could be seen as prideful, like, oh, you think you're better than a priest, a man of God? But again, like, he wants this done right. He wants his God to recognize his child, so he wants to do it himself, and he loves his child, so there's that connection there. And then, 16 years later, at his confirmation, he inquires about his son's position in the church, learning that he's number one, and that could also be prideful. And I wouldn't blame anyone for saying that, but I still think that it's related to fatherhood, caring about where your son is. Like that's a big deal, especially if the church is such a big factor in your life. And then at his son's when he tells the church about his son getting married. The priest points out that the woman who his son is marrying is one of the richest in the community. So you could also see that as a point of pride for the father, but I think it's more that the father's just happy that his son found someone to love, and that he's going to be able to carry on the family line or something like that. It's less a point of pride or anything like that, and more just being a decent father, at least in my opinion. If you disagree with that, if you agree with the pride part of the story, definitely sound off in the comments, because I'd be willing to have a discussion about that. Another interesting aspect of the story and relating to this is the idea of Finn as a blessing. There's an interesting quote that I would like to read to you from the story. "I should very much to have him baptized by myself," he said finally. "That is to say, on a weekday? Next Saturday at 12 o'clock noon. Is there anything else?" inquired the priest. "There is nothing else," said the peasant, twirled his cap as though he were about to go. Then the priest rose. "There is yet this, however," said he, and walking toward Thord, he took him by the hand and looked gravely into his eyes. "God grant that the child may become a blessing to you." And you could relate that back to the pride, like maybe the child is there to teach him a lesson about being too prideful. But I think there's another lesson to be learned here, and what is that lesson? I think it's the idea of considering others, to be considerate of those in your community, especially of your own family, because throughout the story, like through the three views that we see of Thord and Finn's life, where he inquires about him through the church, we see that he is considering others. He's considering Finn, especially because he wants what's best for him. He wants him to be baptized. He wants him to be confirmed, and he wants his church to be he wants the marriage to be recognized by the church. But that also extends to Finn's new wife, his fiance, because if Finn's marriage is recognized, then her marriage is recognized as well. But you also see that at the end of the story, where Thord gives away the money from part of his money from his estate, at least, to the church. And so that benefits the church. It also benefits the community, because in the 1800s, the church was often a larger part of the community. So it's clear that Finn was a blessing, and it allowed him to consider others. And I think that's the main takeaway in the story there. And then the last element of the story that I want to talk about is grief. There is a bit of grief at the end of the story. It's very short, but Bjørnson does find the time to talk about how the death of his son has affected Thord. In this case, he shows up a year later. His hair is gray. He has this bit of sadness in his face, and he tears up a little bit at the mention of his son while talking to the priest. So it's clear that grief has affected him. And there's a lovely quote that I would like to read to you. The priest sat long in silence. At last he asked but gently, "What do you propose to do now, Thord?" "Something better." They sat there for a while, Thord with downcast eyes, the priest with his eyes fixed on Thord. Presently the priest said, slowly and softly, "I think your son has at last brought you a true blessing." "Yes, I think so myself," said Thord, looking up, while two big tears coursed slowly down his cheeks. And so you get that feeling that he's going through grief, but he's also recognizing the love of his son and giving money to the church in the process. Maybe as a way to process and deal with that grief. He does. There is something interesting here. When the priest says, "What do you propose to do now, Thord?" he says, "Something better," which I think is a way of him dealing with that grief, giving away part of his money, part of his estate, but also going out into the world afterwards. It's not indicated in the story, but I think he would do that, and as a way of leaving this community, which has held so many memories of his son. I do think that the Bjørnson's attempt to, or Bjørnson's decision to include that element of grief humanizes the story and makes it better than if it hadn't been there in the first place. Otherwise, this story might have felt more robotic. Anyway, those are my thoughts on The Father by Bjørnson. A pretty great short story, I would say. But I have a qualifier to add to there. If it's a short story about pride, I don't think it quite does its job. But if it's a short story about fatherhood and being considerate of others, I think it works better, in my opinion. If you think differently, let me know in the comments below. I will put a link to it in the description so you can find it and we can talk about it. I'd love to talk about this story and anything that you might know about Bjørnson. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that we can talk more about these types of short stories in the future. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and fatherly travels, or perhaps motherly, or perhaps none of those if you are not a parent. Farewell.